And now that I've got an idea of where these eyes are, it's like I don't have to worry about keeping the details of the nose consistent. I can just concentrate on that overall shape. Likewise, inside the lip, I can just add a little bit more white to this and then make that feel a little less clownish in terms of its color. I mean, if you have any questions as we're kind of going along, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I'm either forgetting or is not relevant, or just kind of gets lost in the shuffle as we're going along. So if you have any sort of specific questions, by all means ask as we proceed.
I noticed that you haven't done much of the background.
No, I haven't. Right. That's a very fair point. When you become more and more familiar with your palette, right, and with how these colors are going to react, you start to become not only familiar with how they're going to react inside the portrait, but also inside the background, inside the clothing, and what effect they're eventually going to have. Right. So I don't necessarily need to put those colors down right at the beginning, right, simply because I've got a pretty good idea of how they're going to react. Right, so it's a fair point. It's like I should be doing that at this stage. Right? I should be basically practicing what I preach as I'm going over this. Right. So because that's the case, let's just say that there's the rest of my hair. It's a nice dye job. Right, and to begin with, right, I'll just block it in with some sort of desaturated orange that is going to tie in these colors here. And I'm going to choose that desaturated orange because I'm going to make Steve old and put gray hair in. You're welcome. Right. Or say like the reflective light of the blue light of the sun coming in through the window over here is going to stand out nice against that as well. So the background, ultimately what I'm going to be doing with it is just using it as a way of accentuating or de-accentuating certain areas of the painting. Right? If I want one area to stand out, I'm going to increase contrast in an area. If I want another area to become less apparent, I'm going to apply less contrast, both in terms of color, value, temperature, all of those things, as a way of directing focus to where I want people to pay attention inside the painting. Ultimately, I'm going to want them to pay attention to this right here. So these areas up here are going to have less contrast. These areas down here are going to have more contrast, as a way of basically visually cueing the viewer that they should pay attention to this stuff right here, as opposed to this stuff up over here or down here. Okay, so we kind of continue blocking in more, or getting a little bit more specific. That's a really useful detail in terms of structuring the eye. Likewise, all of those creases in and around the eye are really useful details as a way of developing the idea of eye. Now it's important that as I'm doing this, that it really is the idea of eye. I'm not trying to develop a complete outline. Right? And this is again where painting and drawing differ significantly with each other. I can get the impression of an eye, and your brain does a lot of the filling in for you. Right? So I don't have to completely finish that particular line. Let's say, there's a better way of explaining this. Let's say if that crease, right, is that long, right, that entire shape is that long, it's much more effective for me to do this, right, as a way of implying that line, so that your brain will basically expand that on either side, right, and allow that to appear bigger than it actually is. The same thing, and even more so with highlights. Right? Highlights will tend to appear much bigger than they are, right, because colors tend to do something called irradiate, right? They have their own radiance value, and brighter that color gets, the more it appears like it has its own inner luminosity, right? So it will appear like it's spreading beyond its boundaries. Whereas dark colors don't really do that. They tend to collapse in on each other. Right? But because of the way that we perceive shapes, we'll tend to imagine this projecting off, right, in either direction, right? We psychologically extend those shapes. And so this is a fancy way of saying is like make things smaller than they need to be, right, in terms of details, right? Because you can get away with a lot in terms of implying those details. And so now that I've restructured this eye, right, because it was off, right, I can again take just a little bit more white, right, into that gray, and now as a way of defining the rest of, or the white of the eye, right, and separating, say, the pupil from the iris. Your eyes are never, the whites of your eyes are never white. Right? They're typically some sort of gray or green or brown, right, or blue. Right? Try not to think of your whites as your eyes as being white. Actually, try to avoid using white, right, other than as a mixing color, right, for the most part, or for the most part of your painting. Try and stick in these midtones. Your whites, we basically interpret anything on the face, right, the brightest section of it, we interpret it as being white. Everything else is basically cued to that. Right? There's no actual white, right, in Steve's portrait. The closest thing that comes to him from my vantage point, right, is this little tiny chunk of reflective light underneath his nose, right? And that's actually more kind of like a soft yellow light, right? More like a cream, right? As opposed to maybe defaulting towards putting something like this. Right? If I do this with the white of the eye, right? You can see how kind of artificial that becomes immediately. And this is a difficult transition again from painting or from drawing into painting, right? Because you're always thinking about value, you're thinking about bright things, right, as being white, right? Lighter things as being white. Whereas in order to separate that, I can just make that a lighter tone, a gray, right? But I can also make it a little bit more yellow or orange, right? As a way of helping to separate that shape as well. Inside this space, I can be a little bit more aggressive with the yellow, right, of my yellow ochre, right, and pull that into that space as a way of defining that section of the underbrow, right? And then I'm dragging that same yellow and a little bit of that flesh tone into the eyebrow as a way of making it a little bit more believable, right? Rather than like an object sitting on top of the head, right? I'm dragging another color into it, basically blending the edges of that area, right, so that it appears to diffuse, right, into the center, into the head. The brown that I've mixed up, like now I can start to apply more local, right, or more subtle color, right, and introduce that brown into the eyebrow itself. Same basic idea as this shape, right? The eyebrow obviously extends beyond that, right? But hair, right, people tend to find hair difficult to do. Imply hair, again, right? And think about hair as having a background to it, having flesh underneath it so that you can feel that you see through that hair, and that the hair gradually diffuses as you get towards the edge of it. So that darkest section of the brow, for me, is going to be right in the middle of that brow, as opposed to me having a really dark shape all the way along the edge of that brow. And I'll do the same thing over here, right, and essentially the same thing underneath the brow over there. And in each one of these cases, I'm just paying attention to, or trying to make those shapes as accurate as is possible, and without changing the structure of the painting. That's a useful point to start off with, is that your structure is going to change, right, as you start moving paint around, right? As you're moving paint around, you're also moving an eyebrow around, right? You're moving a cheekbone around, right? So as those things start to slide around, it becomes more and more difficult to control the two, right? If the structure starts to change pretty dramatically. So for instance, like Steve's forehead here is totally collapsed on it, right? It's basically like it's growing out of the middle of his brow. So in order to go back in and change that, you need, first off, just need to keep an eye on that structure. And here, I'm introducing not a different, introducing a radically different tone, right, as a way of defining that reflective light, but it's basically the same color. Right? I'm just taking that versus and mixing it with white so I get more of a pink variant, and I'm incorporating it into that orange and that orange gray underneath. And all of these things are still going to work. This appears out of place right now because it's nowhere else inside the painting. As soon as I take that pink and put it someplace else in the painting, say as a way of defining that reflective light underneath the eye, right, and then using it as a way of defining all of that reflective light along the side of the jaw. That starts to make more sense. As soon as I take that to a different, that same color, but to a different tone, and start to mix that into, say, the development of a more accurate skin tone, and say, that more reddish tone that Steve has to his face. This starts to make even more sense because now that pink, right, is in another area inside the paint. And so when you're adding one color into one area, right, that color needs to go other places, right? If you've only got it localized in one specific section, things start to look really weird. The reason that they start to look really weird, I've always hated it when people would say, like, that looks weird, don't do that. Why? I don't know, it looks weird. Right? That always irritated me as an example. Why I think it looks weird, right, is simply because things that appear different from everything that's around them, we tend to think of as being important. We tend to think of them as being unique. They stand out, right? They don't seem to fit in, right? Which is a good thing if you want that thing to stand out in that really aggressive way. But if you want it to become part of an overall picture, right, it tends to become more problematic. And so a lot of painting, in terms of how we view them and pictures in general, has a very large psychological component to it. And that's another one of the piles of things that, you know, you basically become, or that you basically start to grapple with as you're doing more and more of this. And so as I define this shape underneath the eye, I'm using that same tone as a way of defining this chunk. And again, that same tone as a way of defining this chunk and painting essentially around that blue color that's defining more of shadow inside that chunk. And then gradually increasing the tone of that yellow, right, as a way of building up towards a more highlight section of the paint. Right. What I'm doing with my finger is essentially what you probably should do with a brush, but once again, right, this is where personality comes into play, and I just can't be asked to use a second brush. I don't even know why I'm holding it. I do promise I will use a different brush at the end of this, but right now, I'm using this big brush for a specific reason. Your big brush right at the beginning will allow you to, or make it easier rather, to stay away from smaller details, and because you won't have the capacity to get into those smaller details with the bigger shape. Right? And it forces you to be a bit more creative with how you're actually using that brush as well, in order to create these shapes. So again, you're implying stuff. I'm making you a lot younger here. You look good, dude. Okay, so I'm not gonna keep describing what colors that I'm using, right? Because for one reason, I'm just gonna be repeating myself, right, unnecessarily, and hopefully, I mean, that's kind of coming across as you're looking at it. And I think it takes away from the flow of the development of things as well. I always like doing this section, mainly because it makes me look like a magician.
That made a big difference.